Here at Labyrinth. I am very excited to welcome you all to tonight's event, a conversation between two scholars of Black radical politics and the carceral state, Donna Murch and Naomi Murakawa, who will be discussing Murch's new book, Assata Shakur, State Violence, Racial Capitalism, and the Movement for Black Lives. In a moment, I will introduce our two speakers, but first a little housekeeping. Tonight's event is a hybrid event, which means we have both an in-store socially distanced audience and an online live streaming audience. After tonight's guests have talked together, there will be time for a Q&A, and we will bring the mic to anyone who has a question. If you are joining us online, you can submit a question for our speakers via the Ask a Question button, as well as buy a copy of the book via the Buy a Book button. If you enjoy tonight's event, you can find future events under the Events tab of our website, labyrinthbooks.com, and sign up for email events updates there as well. Now, let's turn to tonight's speakers. Donna Murch is professor of history at Rutgers University. She is the author of the award-winning book, Living for the City, Migration, Education, and the Rise of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, and is working on the forthcoming book, Crack in Los Angeles, Policing, the Crisis, and the War on Drugs. Joining her is Naomi Murakawa, professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, and the author of the excellent book, The First Civil Right, How Liberals Built Prison America. Both of tonight's speakers have done essential work that can help us better understand hyper-policing and hyper-incarceration, as well as Black radical politics and ingenious critique of these twin tragedies. I am sure that these shared commitments will make for an excellent conversation. Before they begin, I just want to say a few brief words about the powerful book we are here to discuss. For many young Americans, including myself, the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement has politicized us and helped us to begin articulating an anti-racist, anti-capitalist vision of what America must become. Assata Shakur gathers together wide-ranging essays Professor Murch has written between the years of this movement's genesis and the present. As Professor Murch has said, the Black Lives Matter movement interrupted the consensus narrative of law and order to assert that the issue was not the pathology of the Black poor and working class, but rather the devaluation of Black life at the hands of police, prisons, and the extractive economy that undergirds and makes possible the reproduction of Black death. Just as importantly, this movement has often invoked the figure of Assata Shakur, a Black Panther and revolutionary whose life represents the radical potential of Black struggle. In these essays, Professor Murch traces the connection between the radicalism of the 60s and 70s, the horror of the bipartisan war on drugs, and our current moment of Black political resurgence. She also brings specificity to what is so often an abstracted idea, moving beyond the hashtag to the competing claims and diverse strategies of the individual groups that make up the movement for Black lives. It is no overstatement to say that this collection represents a much-needed history that grounds the present struggle for Black life in a longer tradition that asks us to move beyond reform and towards a vibrant revolutionary struggle. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
What a beautiful introduction, Hank. Thank you. And a fitting introduction for such a book. It is inviting us into a half-century sweep understanding of the movement for Black lives. I read it as an invitation to think about the present and the stretch of a longer radical tradition. Something that's really difficult to do because our memories don't go very far, our history gets thin, and the Black Panther Party is known, but often it's just known as a set of sort of gutted aesthetic symbols, even if presented favorably. So I wanted to start by asking you why you decided to start a book with the Black Panther Party in Oakland in 1966.
Thank you so much for that. And I just wanted to thank you, Naomi. I have long been an admirer of your work. I've learned an enormous amount about it. I think going back to even when you were working on your dissertation, we hadn't met, but I'd always heard about you through collective friends and community. So the first civil right is so important, and so I can't imagine someone I would rather discuss Assata with. I also want to thank Anthony Arno and Haymarket Books, which is an amazing independent publisher, and I've had a wonderful experience with them. And with Anthony, this book would not, I can truly say, this book would not exist without Haymarket. And, you know, as we'll be talking about today, we're in such hard times right now. We're all recovering from Tuesday's news, and Haymarket, to me, has been a beacon of publishing and also of community. So Assata taught me, even though much of the book is about some very difficult subjects, it's a book that was written with a lot of delight, because the most of it was written between 2013 and 2015. I was living in Los Angeles, researching my book on crack, and you know, I came of age in the 1980s, and for a long time we needed a mass mobilization against police violence, law enforcement, carceral state, and because I was researching the drug war, there was a real sense there is an enormous archive of activism, but what we didn't see was mass organizing. So underneath this book, and even the title, Assata Taught Me, is a reflection of that sense of joy, really that started, really for me, because of my relationship to Oakland, with the organization around the killing of Oscar Grant. So many of the people in my first book, who I knew and was still in touch with, were involved in that organizing, and it was very broadly based, where it spanned members of an older Black nationalist community from the 60s and 70s, the Nation of Islam, Democratic Socialists, you know, anarchist left. It was a very broad coalition of people. So that's the spirit in which Assata Taught Me was written. And so it's a book that has a double meaning. So the first is the slogan Assata Taught Me. And my extended family is from St. Louis, so I spent a lot of time in 2014 in St. Louis and also in Chicago at the amazing convenings of Barbara Ransby, which were really important in the formation of BYP 100. And I saw people wearing t-shirts that said Assata Taught Me, people carrying placards and protest signs that said Assata Taught Me, sweatshirts. There was, of course, Assata's Daughters in Chicago. So that was kind of the inspiration for the book title. And the second part of the title is really about me, that I read Assata's autobiography when I was 18. Just as it came out, and it was really my introduction into Black radical politics. I'd grown up in Western Pennsylvania, gone to very conservative Catholic schools, and it wasn't really until I went to college that I was introduced to a radical tradition. Once that happened, I could go back and even chart it in members of my family's lives. But Assata was a really foundational book for me, and all the research on Oakland came later. And it was moving to me to see that for multiple generations of people, me coming of age, really at the cresting, and you know, we didn't realize the Cold War was going to come to an end 2 years later. But then for another generation of millennials, many of them born in the 1980s and 1990s. So it was that sense of continuity and also delight at seeing successful organizing.
So seeing the continuity, seeing the ongoing inspiration of Assata Shakur, I'm wondering if there's any misconception that you want to correct about the way people in the present approach the Black Panther Party.
I think that the Panther Party has had this enormous life in popular culture and in political memory. For people my age, I'd say also for baby boomers, but some of the people that were the most critical of the Panthers were actually not the kind of civil rights Black power generation, but the generation after, people that are my age, coming of age in the 1980s. And when I tried to write a dissertation on the Panthers, I was at UC Berkeley. And that really mattered because Huey Newton had applied to the UC Berkeley history department in the early 70s and was rejected, and then ultimately applied to the University of Santa Cruz, where he received a PhD in the History of Consciousness program in 1980. So I was living in the Bay Area and UC Berkeley, and there was a contested memory about the Panthers. So I think the core myths that were constructed around the Panthers is that they were a gang, a criminal organization responsible for violence, and that at their core, they were a kind of theatrical performance, cosplay, with no substantive ideological content. And I find that that is still used. There's a very recent book that came out that makes the same kind of argument, and that also represents the Panthers, literally calls them ethno-nationalists. And I'd say for younger generations of socialists or, progressive young people, there's some contested memory about the party. And I think calling them ethno-nationalists, this was the same kind of propaganda strategy that was actually used by law enforcement, essentially representing the Panthers as a Black extremist hate group. What's so frustrating about this is, one, of course, it's not true, but two, it's reenacting the same kinds of propaganda that were used to repress the organization. And the important organizing piece about the party is that they were an all-Black organization, but they believed in revolutionary alliances with mother country radicals, which is what they refer to, the radical white anti-war movement and anti-imperialist movement, the Brown Berets, Iwar Kun, and then, of course, Japanese radicals. So the Panthers were the originators of a kind of radical revolutionary politics where people organized simultaneously within their communities, but what links movements together was anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism. So it's really striking to hear essentially this utter misrepresentation of the party. And one of the things that's striking is that people often think that the Black Panther Party was repressed because it was a Black organization. And that's actually not true. There were many Black organizations, especially the US organization, who were the founders of Kwanzaa, who never faced this kind of repression. And if you look at FBI documents, I think the core anxieties about the party were, number one, a Black radical organization that was linked to Black urban communities, that believed in Marxist-Leninism, that looked outside the United States to revolutionary struggles in Vietnam, in China, in Cuba, and in the case of the New York Party, because it matters that Assata also comes from the New York branch of the party. So my book, Living for the City, is about Oakland, but the New York branch and some of the East Coast branches were much more Pan-Africanist than the West Coast branch. So they were also looking to Tanzania, to Julius Nyerere, especially to the African continent and its own revolutionary struggles. They were explicit Pan-Africanists in ways that the Oakland Party was not. But their active alliance with radicals, particularly white radicals through the imagination of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and law enforcement, was why they suffered so much repression, because they were seen as potentially building a revolutionary coalition to stop the Vietnam War, to stop American imperialism, and to fight the very basis of capitalism during the Cold War.
So seen as a threat because not just Blackness, but Black-led class struggle that is deeply internationalist and engaged with the state, not just doing a sort of withdrawal, prefigurative set of work, right? So if that's what I'm hearing is the set of corrections, a fuller picture of how we should understand the Panthers and how we should understand Assata. Can I ask you to bring that back to how I sort of launched the conversation, which is when we're trying to understand the movement for Black lives now, why begin with that? With this fuller set. So I get the reference, like everyone's doing a reference, but you pointed us to something beyond sort of the image, right, and the pictures, to some very deep political connections, all of the words, anti-capitalism, internationalism, Black-led class struggle. Can you tell us the work that it's doing to begin there in explaining the present?
Sure, thank you for that. I wanted to start with that because I think that while we still have the iconography of the Panther Party, especially its traditions of anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism, and also the party is best known for its breakfast programs, its survival programs, but in many ways, these were not the forms of mutual aid sometimes in the way that they're conceived today, that they were explicitly political, and the idea was we need survival programs given the stingy and punitive nature of the welfare state with its no man in the house rule, where you had for families to receive cash assistance, you had to have a social worker come in to make sure there was no man in the house. And the 1960s is a period where a lot of the economic and material fight of the Black radical movement and the civil rights movement was to force concessions from the state, to say that we deserve access to the welfare state. So we know in the 1930s that in many ways Black people, through the elimination of the job categories of domestic worker and agricultural worker, were not included within the Social Security Act. So in the 60s, a lot of what's being litigated is trying to get access, saying we deserve access to the state. So the party, it goes through different periods in its history. The earliest period is armed self-defense and the use of police patrols, so policing the state, inspired by the organizing that took place in Watts a year and a half before, 14 months before. But after this period, they move into what they call survival pending revolution. And they have essentially these food giveaway and other service giveaways programs as to shame the state and to make claims on it. And I think it's that tradition, which is both internationalist and really identifying with revolutionary movements and state socialism, that was core to the Panthers' vision. And I think while people take the iconography of the party, one of the many legacies, I guess is the word that I would use, destructive legacies of the Cold War, was the way in which it erased this history. And we're left with a kind of cartoon vision of, oh, the Panthers wore leather jackets and powder blue shirts and sunglasses. But at the core, the party was a group of young people that sought many different types of strategies. It evolved and changed throughout its history. But I think thinking about a party that is anti-internationalist, that is internationalist and fought against anti-communism, was explicitly anti-capitalist, and had a confrontational relationship with the state while simultaneously feeling that they needed to extract resources from the state. And to me, that's one of the most important lessons of the party. And of course, they go through another period in their history, which is they go into electoral politics. And in my first book, Living for the City, I talk about the problems of the incorporation into electoral politics. But nevertheless, it shows their willingness. They wanted to get control of the port of Oakland, which in the 1970s was an enormous source of wealth. And they wanted to tax transactions in the port in order to fund social welfare programs. So I think, more and more among organizers I know, people are using the language of inside, outside, and against the state. And I think while the Panthers were never fully incorporated into the state, and certainly they were against, they also were willing to think about specific policies and strategies from extracting resources.
Thank you for bringing that together and for making it so clear, and for bringing together state violence and racial capitalism as fundamental categories that we have to hold. I think one of my frustrations with, as we've seen a so-called mainstreaming of abolition, I don't know if that's right, but we've seen certainly the spread of the word, is that there's a tendency to think that radical politics is just to point to various things and say abolish it, as if that's the correct intervention. And I feel there's some fundamental either confusions or just not very sophisticated thinking that thinks that anti-capitalism is anti-statism and anti-racism is anti-statism. And what I'm hearing from you and from the book is that there has to be much more meaningful engagement and a willingness to make demands on the state. Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot now. I live in Philadelphia, and I've lived in different cities across the United States and seen different tendencies in the left. And I think that we need to return to the archives of radical struggle, especially in this post-Cold War period. I think that is one of the most important fault lines. And it's a fault line that those of us who are older and lived through the Cold War understand. But there are advantages. I teach at Rutgers Public University, and I teach actually a history methods class that's a requirement. All of us teach it, but I choose to teach it through the lens of the Panther Party. And I assign parts of the Communist Manifesto from that class in order for people to have an idea of what is Marxism. Because we're this post-Cold War generation, I'm not saying that many Americans were well versed in it, but it was considered part of a liberal arts education during the Cold War in a way that it's not now. And there is a delight and an excitement about socialism, and that's wonderful. And I think that is a good thing. People do not feel the sense of fear that older generations of us felt. When I was a graduate student at Berkeley, I had to sign a loyalty oath. It was still on the books, saying I had never been a member of the Communist Party. So that generational fault line really matters. But I think without a connection to these earlier periods of struggle, many people are coming of age at a time in the United States where simply being anti-state it makes sense to me, I understand. We've seen a gutting of so much of the welfare state, the enormous growth in the carceral apparatus, and people feel as if simply the state is only a source of violence, and that's understandable. But that's why I think the archives of past struggle, and that includes the Panther Party, it includes the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, it includes many different tendencies that I think were able both to confront state power and state violence, but also argue that the greatest source of violence is often capital itself and its relationship to the state, and putting that as central, because I think there are different traditions of the left. There's one tradition that says that democracy, liberal democracy and capitalism are simply twins. They are intertwining and dependent on each other. And there's another tradition that says that much of democracy and liberal democracy is born out of concessions from capital by organizing. So whether it's organization of unions or the fighting for rent control or the right to social housing, that in other words, these are concessions that have been made. And I would say that I come from that tradition. And I think that the Panthers provide a window about how to fight the police, fight the carceral state, but also in a country like the US, with its history of white supremacy, in which the centralization of power was feared for interfering with slavery, right? The hatred of the federal government, that this is directly linked to the histories of slavery. So I think that these conversations need to be had, because I don't see another way to deal with the enormous power of capital than to think about fighting state violence. In particular, also the international piece is so important, and we need this kind of mobilization. You have really exciting groups like the Dissenters that Barbara Ransby's daughter, Asha Ransby, is involved in, who are also, like the Panthers, thinking in international ways about the role of American military and American state violence. But forcing the state to make concessions. We need well-funded public schools, we need public infrastructure, we need public transportation, but those are not our only political horizon. And so the Panthers saw this as, non-reformist reforms, I guess we might translate it in today's language, but it wasn't their horizon.
That's great. In thinking about these sort of erasures that we get through the Cold War, McCarthyism, hearing about students reading the Communist Manifesto with delight in your course. It's so wonderful to hear that. And it makes me think about the range of erasures that have happened. And I think one is just, even as the language of intersectionality spreads, and picks up currency, it's very hard for people to maintain a conversation about intra-Black and intra-Asian American and even intra-white class differences. And your book is asking us to hold all of that together and to think a lot about intra-Black class disparities especially of the kind we've seen in the last 40 years. And with that, and I'm sort of uncovering that, I want to ask you to talk about what I'm thinking of as this very particular territory that gets prominent once in a while. It's this little territory called what Black people want. And you have a lot of people since defund. Al Sharpton, Ross Baraka, Joe Biden, who stand up and say, this is nonsense. Black people do not want abolition. They want more sensible policing. This is what real people want. And this little territory, what Black people want, I have to say, reading your book gave me a sort of different sense of the history of what that territory has meant to various people, from Hillary Clinton to various historians who claim to find the roots of mass incarceration in the Black working class. So I think I just want to invite you to maybe either share one or two examples, or maybe just sort of reflect more broadly on what you think that rhetorical turn, this is what Black people want, how that's operating, or what we should think about when we hear that.
Yeah, it's such a terrific question. I think that one of the reasons I started the book also with the Panther Party is I wanted to start at a time of real revolutionary and radical struggle of the late 60s. So not only starting with the story of mass incarceration, because it's so important to have and to hold these periods of mobilization and fight back and new possibilities and all the creativity that's involved in that, and how people build a political organization that seeks to be a member-based organization, which is really important. We can come back to that. But today, I guess in organizing language, this is called base building. But how do you build organizations that attract large numbers of people who believe and are willing to take on risk, both to devote their time and take on risk in order to fight for a different vision of what's possible? I think in the period, really starting in the mid-70s, there have always been class fractures among Black people, as like all people and in the Black community. But one of the outcomes of successful struggle of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the creation of affirmative action, and then the ways in which also government employment especially was opened up. That's really important. It's state-based employment that is the backbone of the middle class. And so the attack that we're seeing in the same time period, when we talk about neoliberalism or retrenchment, the attempt to destroy the post office, state infrastructure, this is overwhelmingly the site of well-paid Black employment. So this successful struggle, and whether it's Malcolm X and Assata Shakur, or the Adam Clayton Powell, or of course King, who we always think of, Ella Baker, this broad spectrum, this long Black freedom movement had these very important effects that were successes. But with those successes also come forms of fracture. And I think Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor was the one to write about this with so much brilliance and force, which is the creation of a new Black political class that emerges. And as that class emerges, we also have what's called the new Black middle class. People are, have much greater access to historically white universities. There's a portion of the population that is upwardly mobile. And I benefited from that as well. I'm absolutely of that generation, coming from a working class family and then going to college and then getting a PhD. That, would not have been possible for my grandfather, even for my mother. So there was a real shift, I'd say, in material access. So for a portion of the Black population, we have more visibility, more power, more money than we've ever had. And the incorporation into the Democratic Party meant that Black mayors, these urban Black regimes that emerged in the late 60s and early 70s, they're emerging at precisely the time that we're beginning to see this march right, and also the development of the carceral apparatus. So you have people like Coleman Young, who had been, I think he was pretty much a member of the Communist Party, certainly affiliated with it, who becomes a major force for violent policing and expanding jailing and, what today we would call racial profiling. So I think that Black people, our leadership is entering the state at a time that it is increasingly repressive. And one of the people that I take on in my book is a political scientist named Michael Fortner, who argues that Black people were the force behind the Rockefeller drug laws. The problem with this is that it's just simply not true. None of the electoral politicians, only one of the state legislatures supported the Rockefeller drug laws, and Rockefeller's own head of essentially drug agencies called the law racist. So they knew. But 20 years later, in the 1980s, because I'm a historian, timing really matters. It's a deep belief in change over time. And in the 1980s, when you have the expansion of the drug war, so we've had different kinds of anti-drug campaigns, and they have always been racialized, going back into the late 19th century. The Chinese exclusion laws were based on anti-opium laws and seeing Chinese people as a threat, bringing opium and seducing white women. You have the all of the criminalization of marijuana use in the 1930s that was especially used against Mexican migrants, or cocaine in the American South used as a panic to justify Jim Crow violence. So these kinds of campaigns against drugs have existed for a long time. But the formal drug war really starts with Nixon in 1970, and then it expands from there under almost every executive. Under Jimmy Carter, there's a slight downturn, but so much of this history I've learned actually from your brilliant book, The First Civil Rights Movement. So the Black political class is entering the state at a time when the most repressive policies are being crafted. And in the 1980s, it's just a fact that the majority of the Congressional Black Caucus supported the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and 1988 that enshrined the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity of crack versus powder cocaine. And I spent a lot of time in an essay on crack in Los Angeles about trying to explain this and to think about it. And I come up with something that's influenced by your work and by others, which is that the problems of disinvestment, racialized disinvestment, as under Reagan you have the taking back of a lot of the money that was funding American cities. It was the fruit of mass protest and organizing that we were having state investment in cities. That money is being taken back. And the only way to get state monies is to support police and carceral programs.
Yes.
This was a way to get state resources. And you have many people signing on to it. I will also say, as I lived through this in a working class community in Western Pennsylvania, there was a public health crisis around crack. Everyone who lived through it, especially in working class communities, saw it, understood it. So it's not only, I wouldn't call it only a problem of disinvestment, as Dr. Carl Hart argues, that it was a genuine public health crisis. And so in the face of crisis, people, the only solutions that were available to them were punishment solutions. But the very painful outcome of this is that people were especially concerned, this is true of my own family, about protecting their children. But the kinds of punitive laws and infrastructure, the creation of elite anti-drug units and anti-gang units, and one thing that's so important about the war on drugs is that it's fungible. If you are said to have drugs, suddenly all of your constitutional rights can be violated. Suddenly the state has the right to seize all of your property, and that can mean from the $10 bill in your wallet to your car, to your necklace, to your house, to your appliances. I mean, and the police do this in Los Angeles. I've forgotten the numbers, I have them in the book, but I think it's over $12 million is taken by the LAPD. There are multiple forms of law enforcement in asset forfeiture. So it's that you're having Black politicians ascending to leadership positions in the Democratic Party at the same time that these are being implemented. And my argument is that it's a class fracture. It's also about timing when Black politicians are entering this state.
It illuminates for me why the very modest defund gestures in certain cities have been nearly impossible to sustain. Because you're referencing certain class fractures, you're also referencing what I can only call a federal and Democratic Party abandonment of cities, just the withdrawal of revenue streams for cities. And the only ones that are left, you know, the JAG burn grants to get extra police for drug busts, and then pushing costs down onto people to pay for their own punishment, which is another thing you discuss in the book. So really I think you're giving us a sort of larger sketch of the political economy that makes defund at the level of the municipality incredibly difficult, even to switch around just small percentages because cities have been starved. And you're gonna get the federal bucks, even if they're not that big for policing, right? Is that right?
Absolutely, and I think in the 1990s, under the Weed and Seed program that was implemented by Bill Clinton, so it's under Bill Clinton that we see the biggest expansion of the numbers of people being incarcerated at federal and state level. But these Weed and Seed programs were, again, they were representing themselves. You hear it even in the name, right? They're trying to use a metaphor of, you know, what are seeds, but, you know, the stuff of life and growth. So it's implying the possibility of social welfare or of something that will nurture community. But 75–80% of those monies were all monies for policing and law enforcement. And one of the most destructive things about Weed and Seed and other policies is that they did have the effect of co-opting churches. That you began to see also with the cutting away of the various ways that the welfare state was being deconstructed. So you have not-for-profits taking on the service provision component. You also have churches and that real movement towards using churches as an infrastructure for social welfare. So I think that that is also the misunderstanding in the interpretation of the Rockefeller drug laws. Unfortunately, I do think Christian churches played a role in supporting punitive politics. And I think when we think about doing abolitionist struggles, doing struggles in our own churches, I think it really matters. Like, this is a place to go and have conversations with people. I have them with my own family all the time, and I often lose, but I try, you know, like these are the conversations that need to be had. So I think in that sense, there is an issue. There is also the problem of growing up in low-income, cash-poor communities where you do have to deal with crime. Crime is a real thing. Social harm is a real thing. And so I think we have to have those conversations with each other and figure out what kinds of alternative supports that can be built.
Yeah, maybe one more question if you have one more, and then we open it up, or we can go straight to.
Can I ask one more?
Yeah, of course.
So, I really want to hear your characterization of the present, because you have such an expansive repertoire and histories that you're working from. So I know this book was just published. The final chapter is a retrospective of you from 2021. And I'm just gonna say, in mid-2022, my head is spinning at the wave and success and speed of voter disenfranchisement, of the anti-CRT bans that are remaking public education, of the destruction of reproductive freedoms, of the attacks on trans children, all of which are moving very fast, some of which weren't even happening when you finished writing this book in 2021, and now they're in dozens of states. And I feel like the classic move is to ask you what gives you hope, but I'm sorry, I'm not gonna do that. I actually wanna know, how are you characterizing this present? What are the words? What's the analysis? Is it right that so many people are using the F word? Fascism, like, how are you thinking of it?
It's a really hard time. I had to take a deep breath before I can even respond. It's a very hard time. The right has opportunities. American history has so many moments of terrible violence. We talk about this all the time, teaching the African history class. Sometimes it's just very hard. You have to teach the history of slavery, and you teach the resistance to it. You teach the history of emancipation, and then you teach the enormous violence of redemption. And the violence that follows always Black accomplishment. And similar stories can be told about indigenous populations and other people of color in the United States. But sometimes it's hard, like we don't always want to teach the AFIAM survey among the faculty. We like to trade off because we like to teach often our own classes so that we can frame African American history in ways that aren't as devastating as just teaching it from point A to point B. So in that sense, it's always been hard, but I'll put it this way, I'll speak also as a person, not as a scholar. This is the greatest period of opportunity for racial fascism to institutionalize itself into minority rule that I've ever seen and that I didn't know was possible. And I love dystopian science fiction novels like The Man in the High Castle, Philip K. Dick, and also, oh my goodness, Octavia Butler, Octavia Butler is exactly the kind of imaginative work that I think we need for this moment, just to also sustain ourselves because of her ability to really locate the crisis of the present and always to remind us of possibility. But it's just really hard. I mean, I'm devastated by what's happening, I can't lie, and I'm afraid. I grew up near the Canadian border. When everything started to get bad, I'm always like, get in touch with my friends in Montreal. How would I characterize this moment? I would characterize it as very fast movement towards minority rule. And many of us are critics of liberal democracy. We know about the limitations of the United States. It's two-party system, that alone. It's winner-take-all elections. It's archaic electoral college system, which is again, all of this nurtured slavery and settler colonialism to prevent true democracy along class, racial, or gender lines. So American democracy has always been profoundly limited and flawed, as has liberalism. But that doesn't mean that we don't have scenarios that are worse. And I remember in the Left Forum years ago, a talk that Emanuel Wallerstein gave, rest in peace. And he was talking about the set of arrangements. He said, we have a current set of arrangements, but it's also very possible in the next decades, we will see a different set of arrangements. And he said it with a real economy of words. We were talking earlier about saying anything is possible politically. I'm witnessing things that I didn't expect to happen. So the seizing of control of the Supreme Court and with the structure of limited American democracy and the way that it's going to make it possible to dismantle the gains that have been made has happened. And I see the latest opinion on Roe versus Wade and defining it as lying outside the quote historical tradition of the United States and mentioning also the overturning of sodomy laws and gay marriage in the same breath and interracial marriage. And I'll just say, so we remind ourselves how close we are to that history. I come from an interracial family. My parents are from St. Louis and they met in 1966. And in order to marry, they had to move to the north. So this is true of my own family and in our own life. So I would characterize this time as a real threat of racial fascism, both in the street, so January 6th, and I did predict that January 6th was gonna happen. I knew that it was gonna happen. I didn't know the form that it was gonna take. I expected that there was going to be violence with the certification of the elections, because the fascists are building a street movement. And I live in Philadelphia, and during the Black Lives Matter protests, they were coming down and beating people up and carrying baseball bats in Fishtown. I actually moved out of Old City because there was such a white nationalist presence there. So I think we have a fight of multiple things on our hands. We have the Supreme Court, we have the midterm elections, we have the presidential election in 2024. I'm not a fan of two-party politics, but now I vote in every single primary and in every single election because I do see voting as a form of harm reduction. But voting is not my identity, so that matters. But we have to be prepared for different kinds of street violence. And a portion of the military, I was never worried about the election outcome in 2020. It also has to do with the American military. But there's also a lot of organizing, right-wing organizing inside the military. So this may sound strange, and this is how I'll end, but I've been thinking a lot about Latin America and about how different countries, especially thinking about Argentina and Brazil, but also Chile, have gone through authoritarian periods in their history, but have had contestation. Because one of the dangers of American exceptionalism is that you feel that, our democracy is going to end, and then history ends. But I think actually looking to other countries and seeing how they dealt with organized fascist movements. And so to end on a more hopeful note, I think left organizing of many forms, organizing in unions, organizing in member-based organizations, tenant organizing, very important. The housing crisis is an enormous one. And then of course, organizing against state violence. I think the challenge will be how to bring together material struggles, which have to be grounded, housing, education, jobs, the material facts that make life possible, and then linking that to the fight against state violence. The expansion of the radical union movement, of course, the victory of Amazon, I always try to remind myself, as you reminded me, that that's a victory for us to remind ourselves of.
Would you share one mic so I can, I'm just gonna bring this mic around to anyone who has a question so that the online audience can hear your question also. First, I want to thank the two of you for this really exceptional conversation. This combination of clarity and sophistication is itself a resource for us in this moment. So starting by thanking you and seeing if there are questions in the room. Start over here.
Okay, thank you guys again. So I just wanted to ask, I was listening to a recent podcast interview that you did with Doug Henwood about this book. And there was a moment in the discussion where you talked about you said the prevalence of prefigurative politics and lateral organizing as sort of like a dominant mode of activism in the present moment. And you talked about, both the strengths and weaknesses of that. And I'm just wondering if there's a little more you could say about that, what works about it, what doesn't, and maybe if there are some examples of solidarity both within organizations and between organizations that you think we should emulate.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I live in Philadelphia, and I've lived in different cities, and slowly you get to know them and build political community. It's very important to me. Since leaving Western Pennsylvania, my life has been steeped in all different types of political communities, sometimes organized, sometimes sets of friends. I've been struck by how common a vision of politics is, which is anti-state, abolitionist. I think abolitionism in many ways has become the lingua franca, the shared lens of much of the left that I inhabit. And it's a kind of politics of really withdrawal confrontational and withdrawal is how I would describe it. So street protest, extremely important in this vision of politics, that the politics of the street are the real politics, the politics of mobilization, the politics of mass action. And I think the reason for that is that there is a discomfort and suspicion and critique of the lack of democracy in left organizations of the past. So I think some of it is born out of the anger or the disillusionment from top-down hierarchical organizations. I think in the movement for Black Lives, this is certainly true. Occupy movement, I don't know nearly as well, but there's a gendered component too. So there is an explicit commitment in the movement for Black Lives to a Black queer feminist lens. And the organizations of years past are often associated with a kind of patriarchal top-down organization. So to be fair, I think that, and there are certainly problems. You know, I could give an entirely different talk about the problems of democracy in the Panther Party, the issues around gender, and what happens in a top-down organization in which you don't have true party democracy. These are real issues. You know, in the party, the Oakland party never let anyone who wasn't from the Bay Area onto the Central Committee. But our greatest organizers were Assata Shakur, Fred Hampton, many other people we can talk about. So I think critiquing kind of an older, it's not, I can call it old left, it's like old new left, organization is part of that. But there is, I think there's become a real affection for lateral forms of politics and consensus decision-making. I see many problems with this, and I've experienced them personally. It's very difficult to have sustained organizing and building towards a campaign with a continual use of consensus politics. It's really hard. So that's the first thing. I think it's really hard to build campaigns. The second thing is a prefigurative idea that if we can simply live our lives differently, if we can live our lives separate from capitalism, if we can create spaces that we see as cooperative spaces, that it is in the lived life that we can transform the world. And that to me is withdrawal.
Yeah.
And it's also only available to people with a lot of resources, right? Who can afford to educate their children without public schools? Who can afford to have a house? You know, and I see it. I mean, I have my own background, and I find it, you know, I grew up in a place without a lot of resources. Very hard to live a prefigurative life in Erie, Pennsylvania, Youngstown, or Gary, Indiana, right? And we know that, you know, having public housing matters. We need better public housing. You know, people having access to systems of provision, it matters. So I do think those have become very dominant. In terms of other forms of politics to look to, I am very excited by what's happening in the union movement. That's why I've spent most of my life involved largely in internationalist and then in kind of more anti-statist, you know, anti-state violence work. And also the 1980s, the solidarity campaigns with Central America. And I had a wonderful mentor who was from Grenada with Maurice Bishop. So that's been my longest political history. But more recently, I turned to the union movement because I think it's so important. And it's a way to have democratic organization, but sustain campaigns and the nurturing and the development of leadership. And of course, the victory of Amazon makes me very happy. In terms of solidarity, I remember like the Longshoremen's Union engaging in strike and protests during the Iraq War and during these moments of the US declaration of war. So figuring out how to have internationalist connections, and certainly the Panthers' sense of solidarity. In our own campaign at Rutgers, it's been exciting to see recentering forms of organizing in which you center the people who have the least or pay the least money and have the least political power. So 80% of the university are adjunct professors, centering their struggles rather than tenure track faculty, and centering the smaller campuses like Camden rather than the wealthier flagship campus that I teach on, New Brunswick. So I guess what I would say is this form of politics in which you privilege the most vulnerable or those that are most in need of resources. And I think that's a good strategy for all different kinds of things that can be applied to it. And I really want to see people fight for rent control. The massive pain that is being inflicted on poor and working class people losing their homes, and Black women in particular. To me, the fight over housing, also really important, looking to organizations like One DC and Washington that are amazing.
So we have another question here online from our audience online. Octavia Diaz-Quinones is following up on what you were just talking about, the international dimension of your work. Could you comment a bit more on the Panthers' connection to Latin America, especially the Cuban Revolution in those years?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Cuba was so important, prior to the Panthers even being formed, the Progressive Labor Party at Merritt College, so the Panthers are formed in a small community college on the edge of a migrant community in Oakland. And there was a trip that was taken. He was supposed to go and he ended up not going, but some of the other rank and file party members went, and they went to Cuba. And Cuba for them was really their own, in some ways it was the revolution that was the closest to them. And as young people, they were inspired by it, inspired particularly by the universal education in Cuba. And Emory Douglas, who is the Panther artist, was also a leader in the party from the beginning, so he served on the Central Committee. And his art was in every issue of the newspaper. And if you ask Emory about what a revolutionary aesthetic is, so much of it came from Cuba, from studying Cuban art and Cuban letters and identifying with it. So in the Panthers' own attempt to try to craft strategies to get ordinary people to join their organization. Because I do think, going back to your earlier question, this is what we need. We need to find base building mass organizations and to think about how you do that. That's why a kind of prefigurative sitting at the table will never work for building a mass organization. Because unfortunately, when you build big organizations, you have to organize with people that you may not like. So I think the Panthers really, really looked to Cuba, and there's lots of Cuban influenced art. There are lots of references to Castro. And interestingly enough, the party was very much focused on what they saw as class struggle. So it was a real identification of seeing this as a victory of agricultural workers and working class Cubans. So Cuba was the inspiration for the party, and I'm in touch with a lot of different party members, and they remain still very identified with Cuba. And of course, Cuba is the haven and has been the haven for Assata Shakur herself. So I think that that's also been a bridge since the Panther Party is a formal organization that is dissolved, that it's Cuba as the protector of Assata Shakur that has been important since.
Anyone else in the room? Maybe I'll ask the last question. I share your sense of whiplash, Naomi, and part of that, in addition to what you named, is the reorganization of global geopolitics as a result of the war in Ukraine. And I want to sort of link into your framing of our moment as still a post-Cold War moment. And I'm just wondering whether it's too soon to tell, especially in connection to these questions of divestment from social welfare in any way, divestment from cities, whether you think we can already start to say how organizing has to reckon with what is coming down the pike in terms of the effects of this radical reorganization that is in the tradition of the Cold War, in terms of militarization and other things, and perhaps more resources again being withdrawn. So maybe it's too soon to tell, but I'm wondering if that's part of your mulling these things as well, either of you.
Yeah, and I think I'm gonna end up asking you, Naomi, what your answer to that question is. You know, what I'm about to say is not sexy, but I think it's true. We need a kind of popular front in which the liberal and the left come together around certain issues. We just need it. The Supreme Court matters. I don't love having focused so much of my attention on this vision of the state where we have to play by the state's rules and think about the two-party system. But I think we do. I think we need a politics of the popular front. Unfortunately, because we are in such a right-wing moment in our history, you know, the original Popular Front was having socialists allied with communists and fellow travelers. It was an alliance of different tendencies of the left. But I think racial fascism is a real possibility in the United States. Of course, it's already here, but its seizure and control of state institutions and its ability to dismantle liberal democracy is real, and it can happen very quickly. And I think it's a scenario, especially people I know that come from conservative parts of the country, that we feel that this is, it's very likely. The extent and depth of it is not clear, but the mechanisms that have been created by the redrawing of voter districts, the passing laws in 19 states in which state legislatures can throw out the ballot and then determine the electoral college delegates for the presidential election, all of the different forms of voter restriction. The basis is there. And one thing I am disturbed by is that I think some people who have grown up in ways that are more protected and privileged and feel less sense of imminent threat are not even privileging the importance of voting rights now. I've been really surprised by it because in my circle, especially with Black women, we're terrified of this happening. We know what the taking away of voting rights means. And I'm kind of shocked that it's something that's not shared. And this is an area where we need a coalition. We need broad people to come together, again, people we don't like. I actually think that's how movements are built. And, you know, it was, I think it was Barbara Smith, it was in Homegirls, but it was Bernice Regan Johnson that made the difference between home and coalition. So I just think that we need to build coalitions. I think this is the only way. We need to push the Democratic Party to the left. We need mass street protest and organization, but then we need the building of broad member-based organizations that are not only professional organizers, but we also need to get the not-for-profits. I think that we need to figure out strategies around what the core shared things are. And certainly it's protecting women's right to choose, protecting gay marriage, preventing overturning of the sodomy laws, protecting basic protections like the right to organize a union, the right to have clean air and clean water. So I think we need those as coalitions, but then we need to also fight for the world we want, not only the world we fear. But those two have to be in dialogue with each other. Can I pass the question to you?
No, I think that was a very sexy answer. And in true coalition, I'm gonna say I'm down with that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You know, your book is called Assata Taught Me, but here you are, both of you, teaching us so much. And I increasingly feel like the call to end on a hopeful note is itself a false note today, but there's a call to end on a helpful note. And both of you have done that and I have found this hour with you helpful. So thank you, please join me in thanking you.